Shabbat shalom again. I'm honored again. I'm honored that you're spending the whole day together with us. This is great. Okay, so we're gonna spend the next little bit talking about the story that I alluded to this morning, or said a bit about this morning, the Akedah, binding of Isaac, which is in Genesis 22. If we had a lot of time together, I would love to work through it together line by line, because it's actually astonishing how 19 verses can pack such a punch that 3,000 years later we're still struggling with it, grappling with it, fighting about what it actually means. Narratively, literarily, as a storytelling choice, biblical narrative is just so different from some other stories that we are familiar with from the ancient world and the way we tend to do things today. So if you think, for example, about Homer, the amount of time that would have taken Homer to tell the story of the Akedah would have stretched over hundreds and hundreds of lines. And we would have appreciated it because he would have done a fantastic job of drawing out the psychological drama that must have gone into it. But what we have in the Bible is just so skeletal. Right? And that seems to be an intentional choice. The biblical narrative doesn't go into the psychological drama. And I was just studying with someone yesterday, actually, the story of the Exodus and the 10 plagues. And we were talking about how in the movies, Pharaoh becomes a multi-dimensional character, right? Like, what's going on in Pharaoh's head? How's he struggling with his different values? But the Bible's just not interested, right? Like Pharaoh's promises something and then says, no, I'm not going to do it. Right? But why? Like, what's he struggling with? But the Bible doesn't talk about the psychological internal drama of characters. So that leaves a lot open for discussion and deliberation and anxiety, really, as we look at these stories and we try to piece together, like, how do we read this, right? How do we flesh it out? One important point about the Akedah is that even though in the Jewish tradition it's called Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, and in the Christian tradition it's called the sacrifice of Isaac, Isaac is a bit player in this story, right? It's really a story about Abraham. The focus is on Abraham the entire time. Isaac has one half line of speech, and otherwise he's not a major character. He's so much not a major character that if you read it straight, and I'll certainly encourage you to do this with Rosh Hashanah coming up, and it'll be, of course, the centerpiece of the service. At the end of the story, Isaac's not even in the story. You could argue that the story has forgotten to untie Isaac. No one ever unties him. He doesn't come down the mountain. As far as we know, he's still up there tied on the altar because he's just not a central character. Right? The focus is entirely on Abraham. But, and here's the point that I want to make, readers from centuries and millennia ago already said, but hold on, that might be a literary choice, but that's not an ethical choice. Because the person whose life is on the line here is Isaac's life. So it might be a story about Abraham, but is it really fair to have the person who's going to be killed not even get a voice in the story? And that's something you mentioned earlier about consent. So with sexual ethics, that's one issue. With homicide, that's a whole different issue. And people have responded to this in all sorts of different ways. So I put on the sheet here a painting by Caravaggio, which is in the Uffizi, which I think is a stunning picture for all sorts of reasons. And there's a whole art history tradition of depicting the binding of Isaac. Which part of the story you choose to depict, of course, is the first artistic choice you have to make, because you can't depict a story, right, a dynamic narrative. You have to depict a static scene, at least once you get to the Renaissance and you don't get to depict lots of things side by side. So most of the artists choose to depict the moment that Abraham is about to slaughter Isaac and an angel appears. Not everyone, but most of them do choose that moment as the moment, presumably, where they see the highest drama in the story. But what Caravaggio does, which is quite arresting is he has Isaac clearly not consenting. You see Isaac there. I don't know what's going on in his mind or in his heart, but his mouth is open in a sort of half scream. And really importantly, and of course, if you go online and find the picture online in the rich color, Isaac's eye is looking directly at you. And I think there's something to be said that Caravaggio wants you, the viewer, to see Isaac looking out of the canvas at you and saying, like, look, I'm about to be killed. Like, what can you do about this? I need someone on the outside to actually step in, because my father, right, the person who I would have put all my trust in, is suddenly on the wrong side of the story. That theme that Caravaggio, I think, captures in just that one eye is a theme that I want to circle around a bit this afternoon. This theme of, maybe not everything is right in the story. That when we read it, we're not simply supposed to assent and say, yeah, well, God said so Abraham's doing what he's supposed to do. But that we're supposed to say, hold on a second. It's like something has gone very wrong here if Isaac is bound on the altar and about to lose his life. For Christians, and there's a long history to this question, but for Christians, already going back to the earliest Christian literature we have, the story of the binding of Isaac is a Passover story. Isaac is the Paschal Lamb. The Paschal Lamb is Jesus. And so that triangle means that Isaac, the binding of Isaac, is a Passover story. There is a pre-Christian history to this, I won't belabor, but the Christians didn't come up with those equations. In Jewish literature that we have from before Christianity, it's explicit that the story took place on Passover. It's in a book called the Book of Jubilees, which comes from roughly the early 2nd century BCE. And in the Book of Jubilees, which is a Jewish text, which remained a canonical text for some communities for a long time, but of course was not for most Jews, actually for any Jews. Once you got to the Common Era, the date of the Akedah, the date of the binding of Isaac, is explicitly the month of Nisan, and the 7 days that it took Abraham to walk 3 days to Mount Moriah, offer a sacrifice, and come back 3 days. Those 7 days are the precedent for the 7-day festival of Passover. The Christians sort of take this and run with it. They're like, yes, Isaac is a Paschal Lamb, Jesus is the Paschal Lamb, Isaac and Jesus go together. And in fact, there are lots of parallels, once you say it, between Isaac and Jesus. Right? So both of them are born a miraculous birth. Both of them are the one and only sons, Isaac of Abraham and Sarah, Jesus of God. The birth of Isaac is introduced with the Lord visited Sarah. Right? We'll read this on Rosh Hashanah. Hashem pakadet Sarah, Asher Amar. Like, what does that mean that the Lord visited Sarah and then she got pregnant? It seems a bit, un-Jewish. Both Jesus and Isaac carry the wood to their own executions. Right? Again, not a trivial point. And then both, and this now in the realm of maybe homilies, but ancient homilists took this very seriously. Jesus, of course, is dead for 3 days and is then resurrected. Isaac walks for 3 days towards his death and is then granted a reprieve on life. So the early Christians took this triangle of Isaac, Paschal Lamb, Jesus, and they're like, yes, that's exactly what's going on. Not so surprisingly, as soon as the Christians did that, Jews were like, forget it. This is not about Passover, after all. And we take the story of the Akedah, and it becomes a centerpiece of the Rosh Hashanah service. Right? The Akedah now becomes a story of the new year, rather than a story of Passover. But this is just the sort of tip of the iceberg of a vast differences between the way Jews read the story and the way Christians read the story. And there's actually a long list of differences. I already alluded to one, that Christians call it the sacrifice of Isaac. We would never call it the sacrifice of Isaac, for obvious reasons, right? He's not sacrificed. The point is that he's not sacrificed, not that he is sacrificed. For Jews, it's really not a story about sacrifice. It is a story about faith, a story about devotion. I would argue, and I tried to put this in writing, but things never come quite out the way I want them to come in writing. That's a story about religious growth over the course of the story. Even though it's a very short story, I think the story is really one of Abraham's religious growth. Now, I'll say this really just very briefly. It's not a new idea. It's something that's been said repeatedly in different ways for at least explicitly the last couple of centuries, but implicitly, I think, for much longer than that. That Abraham develops as a religious figure over the course of just these 19 verses. At the beginning, Abraham thinks that God wants child sacrifice. Now, as we now know well, child sacrifice was practiced in the ancient world. Not everywhere, and obviously it cannot be a universal practice because that's the end of the world. But it was actually not uncommon. We know mostly from the cultures that we call Phoenician, but we know actually mostly from what we call the Phoenician diaspora, but not from the Phoenician homelands in Syria and Lebanon and northern Israel, but from the Phoenicians out in the Mediterranean. Carthage is the best documented place where we actually have a massive cemetery, which archaeologists call a Tophet. Anyone know why it's called a Tophet? Where'd they get that word from? Tophet. Yeah, where's it from? Exactly. So archaeologists took the word from the Bible, where the Tophet is a place in Gei Ben Hinnom, right, which has all sorts of afterlives. Now it's Sultan's Pool, so it's a concert arena. But also gave its name to Gehinnom, right, Gehenna, or Gehenna in the New Testament, hell. Right? And part of the reason why it has that reputation is that prophets, Jeremiah tells us that's a place where child sacrifice was practiced in ancient Israel. So there's a Tophet in Carthage, which has something like 40,000 burials of children. This is over the course of 600 years, so not 40,000 children at a time. But you do some arithmetic and you realize that that's a lot of kids, even on an annual basis. And some of them even have inscriptions where a parent says, I'm offering this child because the God has fulfilled what I asked for. So I'm now fulfilling my vow that I offered to the God. This practice of child sacrifice was a real thing. Greek and Latin authors comment on it in horror, but they do comment on it. And it seems like the story is one where at the beginning, Abraham is partial to this. And there's a good case to be made. There are no kids. Good case to be, you're too old. Good case to be made for child sacrifice. But I mean, I say this like it sounds crazy, but there actually is a good case to be made for child sacrifice, right? Because when you think about the relationship between a human and God, especially an all-powerful God, like what can a human possibly give to God that avoids the problem of at least the appearance, but probably also the real phenomenon of, well, I'm probably doing this to God because I want God to do something for me. And so we have all sorts of sacrifices in the Bible that are mandated, right? We just last week read the first fruits sacrifice. So, a farmer plants fruits and brings the first fruits to the temple. Now, sounds wonderful, but is it really realistic that the farmer is not thinking, God, I'll give you the first fruits this year. I really hope that next year I have as good or better a harvest. Right? Because after all, God can produce that, can provide that. And so giving to God can never be purely altruistic. Right? I'm going to give to God, but I'm always hoping that I'm going to get back from God. Right? Some philosophers have called this the problem of the rich spouse. Right? Let's imagine a couple where one spouse doesn't come from money, but the other one has a lot of it. How does the rich spouse ever know that the other person is really in love with them for who they are? Isn't it always possible in the back of the mind that they're marrying for money? Unavoidable, right? There's always like a little voice saying like maybe there's an ulterior motive here. God has the problem of being a rich spouse. How does God ever know you actually care about God? Maybe you just care about God because God can give you more grain next year. There's no way out of that problem. But child sacrifice is a way out of that problem. I can give you a sheep in the hopes that I get more sheep. But it seems to be absolutely nonsensical to say, I'll give you a child in the hope I get more children. Children are not fungible in that way. Right? So child sacrifice has a good religious case to be made for it. I'm not advocating it, lest anyone lest I be misunderstood. I don't know where this live stream is going. So I'm not advocating child sacrifice. But there is a good case to be made for it as the only way to really show God that I actually care about God because of my relationship with God, not because of what God can provide for me. At the beginning of the story, I think it's fair to see that's Abraham's understanding. Well, God wants child sacrifice. Again, there's a case to be made for that. God's self might actually be tempted to want child sacrifice. But the end of the story says, God says, absolutely not. And I don't want child sacrifice. Why not? In my understanding, the reason is because the whole idea of child sacrifice assumes that a child is mine to sacrifice. Right? I own sheep. I can give you a sheep. I have kids. Right? Even say the same sentence. Right? I have sheep. I have kids. Sounds like I have kids in the same way that I have sheep. And God wants to, or the story wants to, draw a hard wedge between them. You have sheep in the sense that you possess the sheep, you own the sheep, you can do what you want with the sheep. You have kids in an entirely different way. The Bible is actually very clear elsewhere, and this is a break with things that we know from elsewhere in the ancient world, that this is going to sound trite, but I think it's a really profound point. Kids are people too. So we don't have kids suffering for their parents' sins in the Bible. On the contrary, we read just a couple of weeks ago in Deuteronomy, kids shall not be killed for their parents' sins. Whereas in the laws of Hammurabi, in the Middle Assyrian laws, you have lots of cases where a parent does something wrong, and the punishment is that the kid bears the punishment. Because after all, it's my kid, right? So my punishment should be that my kid suffers. The Bible says, no. Your kid is their own person. And therefore, it's not fair to punish a child for what their parents do. And that's the lesson, at least one of the lessons of the Akedah, the repudiation of child sacrifice. Once you say that, child sacrifice makes no sense anymore. But it's not that it's morally abhorrent because it's killing something. It's morally abhorrent because it takes the child as subservient and subsidiary to the parent. Right? That my religiosity is going to be acted out with the death of a child. Which brings us back to Caravaggio. Right? That I looking at you says, but wait a second, who am I? Why am I on the altar? Right? If my father is so faithful to God that he feels he needs to sacrifice himself, let him sacrifice himself. But why am I the one who's about to have my throat cut? Now, it's certainly true that there are later Jewish sources, and unfortunately Jewish history is full of cases of martyrdom, and Ashkenazi Jewish sources are even tragically full of cases of parents actively killing their children to avoid what they perceived as a worse fate, being raised as Christian, suffering at the hands of Christians. And in those contexts, the Akedah got repurposed. Well, here's the story about it. Here's a story where we learn about a parent doing such a thing to their child for faith. So that's certainly part of the reception history of the Akedah. But I strongly think that that's not the original purpose of the story. Instead, again, I'd sum it up as the Akedah is primarily about Abraham's moral and religious development and the limits of parental authority. Now, in the title, I said that I wanted to talk a little bit about Leonard Cohen. It said Jews, Christians, and Leonard Cohen. It's sort of an intentional division. It is not the case that all of the world is divided into Jews, Christians, and Leonard Cohen. That's certainly not true. But Leonard Cohen has played with the Akedah for essentially his entire career. Right? So, talking to some people over lunch, spent a couple of years, sort of a deep dive into Leonard Cohen, as I got a sense of how interesting some of his songs were. Like, well, what else is there? And because I was writing about the Akedah, I had an excuse, I had a sort of professional excuse to survey his work. From the very beginning, when he was a poet and not yet a musician, he was already thinking about the Akedah and using it in certain ways. I gave you a line at the top of the second page from a poem from his first poetry collection, The Spice Box of Earth, called Prayer of My Wild Grandfather. And this is the grandfather, for many of you know something of his biography. So his mother's father actually lived in South Carolina for much of his life, but moved up to Montreal to live with the family later on, and was a very pious Jew. I don't know exactly daily what his practices were, but certainly he remembered him as a very pious Jew. And I'm just taking this out of context now, but just to exemplify his interest in the Akedah already at the beginning, he gave you his children, opened on a table. And if a ram ambled into the garden, you whispered nothing about that, nor held his killing hand. So if you have a story in a poem about a child being offered where a ram presents itself as the alternative, that is obviously a reference to the Akedah. But Cohen says his grandfather would not hold his killing hand. Right? Now that, if you're thinking of precedents for that, you might remember Wilfred Owen's poem from 1917 or 18. I don't remember exactly when he wrote it. But Wilfred Owen was the great and enduring poet, British poet of World War I, who died in the trenches in 1918, who talks about the old man of Europe, who sends out their kids to the slaughter. And even when there is a chance to sacrifice the ram of pride and thereby save the children, he would not do so, but killed his children one by one, and half the seed of Europe one by one. So there's maybe an echo of that in Cohen's depiction here, right? The refusal to take the ram as an alternative. But I'm not going to spend too much time on Cohen, but if you sort of survey his work about the Akedah in particular, he has a poem that's directly about the Akedah, the story of Isaac, from 1969, where he seems to use Isaac actually really bluntly. Like, honestly, it's not his best poem, but he sort of like heavy-handedly uses the story of the Akedah as a metaphor for the Vietnam War. And he says, "You who build these altars now, you've seen no vision or God," right? So unlike Abraham, what's your excuse? You're just sending kids to the slaughter for no reason. And unlike Abraham, and he actually has an interesting image of his own father there, who carries a golden axe. Golden axes are actually not good cutting tools. Gold is not actually a hard metal. So he seems to be playing with like a golden axe that's ceremonial, but not actually all that scary, as opposed to you who build these altars now, who are sending kids off to slaughter. And who was I talking to about Bob Dylan? Yeah, thank you. So plausibly, he was inspired by Bob Dylan there, who in Highway 61 already uses the Akedah, draws on it, but Dylan sort of goes in, I don't understand what direction he goes on in that song. Whereas Leonard Cohen uses it in, again, very blunt, heavy-handed way to say, Abraham might be willing to sacrifice Isaac. That doesn't license you in Washington to send kids off to Vietnam to die. Right, so Dylan has other songs where he's equally blunt, but Cohen seems in that song to have sort of adopted Dylan's bluntness, and it's honestly not his high literary point for that reason. It's not subtle, it's not very nuanced. It's really just a sort of heavy-handed use of it. But I'm interested in Cohen's attitude towards the theology of it, because he keeps coming back to this question of suffering, of Isaac's suffering, and the the question of whether that's licensed or even needed or maybe even positive in some sense theologically. And he seems to go in all sorts of directions with it. And as a poet rather than a theologian, he can do that, right? He can write a poem that explores one direction and then a few years later write a song that goes in a different direction. Sort of exempt from the needs to be a systematic philosopher. He gets to do that in all sorts of interesting ways. Just say Cohen certainly understood the need for violence. He's not a pacifist, right? He doesn't react violently or negatively to all sorts of violence. He's very explicit. Actually, in the poem that I started with, "The Prayer of My Wild Grandfather," he has a really interesting image that's really resonant today, sort of in a difficult way. He talks about his grandfather seeing soldiers walking around in Tel Aviv, and he's saddened to see Jews with guns, but is happier than them going to their deaths in Auschwitz. That's a dilemma and a dichotomy that I think is still sort of torturing us. It's what we want from our kids, but what's the alternative? And that's the question that he was attuned to back in 65 years ago or so. But he certainly does understand that violence is needed in the world sometimes. Also seems to be attracted to the sense of surrender, of powerlessness, of thinking that there's a higher force out there that sometimes all we can do is surrender to. I gave you a quote from one poem that was released one song that was released posthumously called "Puppets." It's actually a horrifying song. German puppets burned the Jews. Jewish puppets did not choose. Puppet vultures eat the dead. Puppet corpses they are fed. Puppet me, puppet you. Puppet German, puppet Jew. Puppet presidents command puppet troops to burn the land. The theology here is just so dark. If there are puppets, there must be a puppet master. And so he seems to be sort of surrendering to the greater force in the world. But the equation of Germans and Jews, so disturbing that he seems to have sort of allowed that theology to take him to a place that's absolved us of all moral responsibility. Right? If there's a puppet master and therefore we're all just playing roles, then comes to the conclusion that what's the difference between the Nazis and the victims? We're all just puppets in God's great show. That seems to be, at least for me, a bridge too far. But in his last released album before he died, "You Want It Darker," so stirring and evocative on so many levels, including the fact that he uses Haddish right before, 6 weeks before he died or something, at least. But the theology, again, is quite fascinating. So let's just look at these lines. "If thine is the glory, mine must be the shame." A little bit, but "you want it darker. We kill the flame. Magnified, sanctified be thy holy name. Vilified, crucified in the human frame. A million candles burning for the help that never came. You want it darker. Hineni, hineni. I'm ready, my Lord." There's, like with any good poem, there's a lot to unpack here. The million candles burning for the help that never came, in my mind, must be a Holocaust reference. Maybe specifically the million children, but whatever it is, the help that never came is clear. But that first line is the line that took me a while to realize that might be really profound and yet really disturbing. "If thine is the glory, mine must be the shame." Yours is the glory, mine is the shame. He seems to be thinking here about honor and glory in the world as a zero-sum game between God and humanity. The more that humans suffer, the more that God is glorified. Magnified, sanctified, be thy holy name, vilified, crucified in the human frame. Now, even Christians wouldn't say it in such stark terms, but there is an element here of theology that's familiar from parts of Christian theology, that the human suffering, not necessarily broadly human suffering, but one particular human suffering, is a magnification and sanctification of God's name in the world. And Cohen seems to be sort of extending this, that the more that we suffer, the more that God's name is magnified and sanctified. Now again, I'm not espousing this theology. I'm sort of struggling to articulate what it is that he seems to be saying, but since he does then go to the Holocaust, the darkest thought that he seems to entertain there is that the Shoah somehow brings glory to God. More that we suffer, whereas our intuition might be that this is a stain on God's record, the more that we suffer, the more glory to God. Now again, I don't want to claim that this is Christian, but it's certainly more Christian than Jewish. The debasement of humanity is God's glory. I think the Jewish-Christian lines were certainly blurry for Cohen, right? There are lots of interviews with him as he's exploring Buddhism and playing with different religions. And someone asked him at one point, are you searching for a new religion? And he said, absolutely not. I have a very good religion. It's called Judaism. And yet his Judaism was clearly open to influences, ideas from elsewhere. So when I said in the title of Jews, Christians, and Leonard Cohen, that's because in this realm, at least, I think he doesn't really quite belong in either of the other categories. He's really interested in the Akedah because of the suffering involved. But he takes it in a direction that I don't think Jews or Christians would have gone in. Now let me come back to sort of more normal Jewish sources. Because for Christians, the whole point is Isaac is Jesus, the sacrifice is the crucifixion, there's really no room to question, to criticize. It had to be. Abraham is essentially playing the role of God. Right? God sacrifices his own one and only son for the benefit of humanity. Abraham does the same, foreshadowing that. But Jews, who were much more ambivalent about what exactly the story was about, we're open to thinking maybe this wasn't exactly a model story. Maybe Abraham wasn't flawless in this story. And what I said a few minutes ago about seeing Abraham developing already presupposes that the early Abraham in this story still has work to do. Right? He's not there yet. So none of us are perfected, but even in the story, he's better at the end than the beginning. Which means that if we can articulate that, that means we can articulate a criticism of him. What did he do wrong? And I think, rabbis get this often, the sense from us, from modern Jews. We sit there in the synagogue when the Akedah is read on the Rosh Hashanah, or, not that long after in Parshat Vayera, and we sort of, we're like, well, we're modern, like we're cynical, right? We don't take this as just a exemplary story. I get it. My ancestors were all very pious, like, of course, but we're too smart for that, right? We're too moral for that. We can't read this without sort of commenting on the fact that Abraham is ethically inferior to us. And what I think is fascinating is that this is not a new sentiment. So there's actually a lot of text about this, but I'll just give you one. It's in the middle of the second side of the page. This is a 1,500-year-old poem by one of Judaism's greatest poets, Elazar ben Rabbi Kiliri, who supposedly lives in 6th century Palestine, when it's Byzantine Palestine. It's actually called Palestine at the time, so that's not anachronistic. And I'll give you just a bit of the frame to understand what's going on here. This is actually a poem that Kiliri wrote for the holiday of Shavuot. So if you had been in the synagogue in Byzantine Palestine, it would have been entirely different from the experience that we get. It is triennial, right? But actually triennial, right? So the Torah is divided into 3.5 years worth of parshiot, right? Short parshiot. Every single verse, after someone reads it, someone translates it into the vernacular, then Aramaic. It would have been introduced with a midrash that would have connected it to other parts of the Bible, and most relevant for us, The prayers, certainly the Musaf, but apparently also Shacharit, would have been introduced with a long liturgical poem, piyut. Piyut, of course, just comes from the Greek poetess, piyut, that would have woven together the themes of the Torah reading with the themes of the weekly prayer in a long and intricate poem. How much of that in Hebrew? How much of that would have been understood by the regular synagogue goer is unclear. The performance certainly would have been more memorable than any of the particular lines, but you might have caught a line here or there that was really resonant or insightful. And Koller is one of the greatest of these poets of the piyut. So he writes a poem for Shavuot, where the entire context is, why was the Torah not given until so late in human history? Creation, no Torah. Noah, 10 generations later, still no Torah. Abraham, 10 more generations, still no Torah. Why is the Torah not being given? And so the poem imagines a series of dialogue where God keeps saying to the Torah, okay, now I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you to Adam. And the Torah says, Adam, I don't think I should go to Adam. After all, Adam did as follows. I'm going to give you to Noah. The Torah says, Noah plants a vineyard, gets drunk. I'm not going to Noah. Then he gets to Abraham. And God says, okay, here's a fantastic person. I want to give you to Abraham. And then the Torah answers in the passage that I gave you on the page here. The faithful one, that's the Torah, answered to the Lord to praise him and exalt him. The young man with whom you graced him when his strength was spent. In other words, the Torah says, Isaac, whom you gave to Abraham, he bound on the wood of the altar. Arrested for 3 days, he offered his chick. It was pleasant. His offering was accepted. He became great. His reputation spread throughout the land, right? He's not saying Abraham did wrong, but he forgot how a father is supposed to have mercy on a son. A prayer or a plea he should have offered. Okay? Torah says, and of course this is not the Torah, this is Koller saying something which presumably lots of people felt, even 1,500 years ago. He said, okay, if God appears to you and says to do something, I don't know what I do. Right? I'm not going to pretend I know how I respond in that situation. But at least offer a protest. But Abraham doesn't even say, God, it's my kid. Don't take it out on him. Right? A prayer or a plea he should have offered. He's simply not a good father. He might be the most pious man in the world. He hasn't failed vis-a-vis God, but he's failed vis-a-vis his child. His piety has come at the expense of his basic humanity as a human parent. And that sort of criticism, I assume, is timeless, right? So we happen to have some text from 1,500 years ago. Nothing happened 1,500 years ago that would make this a new criticism. So if it's people are saying this 1,500 years ago, I'm sure people are saying it 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. People have always read this story with a modicum of criticism, right? Say like, okay, there's a lot of piety here, and I'm a bit in awe of the piety, but I'm also a bit terrified of this piety because the piety seems to have run roughshod over what I actually take to be very important other values, like being a good parent, being a loving parent. It seems sort of obvious that the life of one's own child ought to be, alongside piety, also an important value. So really interesting that the upshot of this in the poem is that therefore, and again, this is a literary device, but therefore, the Torah couldn't be given to Abraham. The Torah couldn't go to someone, no matter how pious, no matter how faithful, wasn't also a good parent. The Torah says, I need to wait. I need to wait for someone who can balance it all. Now you're going to tell me that Moses has trouble also, and that's a fair point. So I'll set that aside. But the claim here is that the recipient of the Torah needs to be someone who balances not only their piety alone, doesn't allow the piety to take over, but balances the piety with their responsibilities vis-a-vis people around them. That sort of balance is where the Torah can be found. But I also want to emphasize that this is a criticism of Abraham. Right? So it's a lovely point, but it's also a critical point. The point where readers look at Abraham and say, I'm not totally on board with the story. And that's something that it's very famous that Jews protest. Jews argue with God. Right? This is a literary motif that's been traced throughout Yiddish literature, but not only Yiddish literature. It has a long tradition in the Midrash and the Talmud. We argue. And that's one of the best things that we do. Because we don't take it and just say, well, okay, if that's the text, then that's what we have. We take the text and we say, hold on. I'm not checking my critical faculties at the door, right? I want to think about this. I want to argue about this. I want to argue with each other, right? We can argue about this. I hope you'll argue with me. But we can also argue with the text. We can argue with the Torah. We can argue with Abraham. You know, Abraham says he gets up in the morning and he saddles his donkey and takes his son. And we're like, wait a second, Abraham. I want to have a conversation. I'm not so sure that's exactly what you need to be doing now. Maybe at least you should have argued. All right, so that's the last real point that I want to make. But I'll close with just one last text, and this is from modern Elie Wiesel's reading of the Akedah. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. You can't really blame me for that. Yeah, the comment is that, what's your name? Deborah. Deborah's upset at me for leaving Sarah, which is a legitimate critique. I will own the critique. I will also, step aside and let the critique go to the story, which doesn't mention Sarah at all. So I actually think this is a fundamental point. I have a lot to say about it. I have actually wrote it, but I would say as follows. I actually think that the role of Sarah, who's absent, can be seen as a corrective to what we were just talking about. And if we had a lot more time, I would have brought more texts for this, because there are ancient texts that go in this direction as well. It actually gives Sarah a voice. So there are poems, again, from late antiquity, where Abraham gets up in the morning and says, should I tell Sarah about this? I better not. Because I know what Sarah's going to say. Sarah's going to say, and it's not a direct quote, but it's more or less a direct quote. It's in Aramaic, but more or less a direct quote. Sarah's going to say, I always knew you were too pious. I always knew you were too zealous for God. You must not take my son, who is not only your son, but my son as well. You must not take him in the name of your God. And that, I think, is just the tip of an iceberg, but there is a real iceberg here of restoring Sarah's voice to the story. And I think lots of readers, and again, back in ancient times already, lots of readers read Sarah as the corrective to the flaw that we just articulated. That Sarah never would have done this. So some modern writers have really taken this and run with it in I think, quite beautiful ways. I think are actually not distant from a plausible reading of the text itself, because it's striking, just on a literary level. Right? I don't want to spend too, I want to let people go, but chapter 12, God shows up to Abraham and says, Abraham, go by yourself. Right? What does Abraham do? Take Sarah. Right? He says, by myself. That means with my family, right? I'm not going by myself. That's crazy. Right? So by myself must mean with my wife, with my nephew, right? I'm going to go with my family. I don't know whether that's exactly what God meant. But Abraham certainly gently corrects God, right? God says, by yourself. Abraham says, sure, with my wife. Right? And since that time, Sarah has been with him in every single story. So it's not just a modern feminist realization that when we turn to chapter 22 and Sarah's not there, something's wrong. There's some correlation between the fact that Sarah's absent and the fact that the story has just gone in a really dark and disturbing direction. And I think that impulse is definitely correct. Of course, that's not her son. She's not willing to sacrifice him. She sends him out. Yes. She has a hard side to her. That's certainly true. Again, I think, what do you read? You read chapter 21 and 22? Okay, so when you read 21 and 22 this year, 21 contains the banishment of Ishmael. Just pay careful attention to how many ways that story is verbally and thematically similar to the Akedah. There's all sorts of phrases that are just mirrored in 21 and 22. There's a lot there. But Debbie, thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't give her more due. I think that's fair. The ancient sources don't articulate what would have been the result. They articulate it as him wanting to avoid the conflict. But even the conflict is really the key point here, right? Because it restores a different voice, right? To use a really loaded term in this context, right? So a different voice, Sarah would have argued, right? So Abraham hears it and says, okay. Sarah would have heard it and said, right? There's something more important here. There's at least something different. Okay, so, but that is, that's an ayin you must hear, right? You're like, thank you. I should have spent more time on it. But let me circle back to Eli Wiesel, and with this we'll close. Wiesel has a really brilliant reading, which is published in his book Messengers of God, but you can actually find on YouTube a video of him giving it as a talk in New York in the 92nd Street Y, where you get his voice and the dramatic renditions. So the genre that he uses is essentially retelling the story, weaving in his interpretations, weaving in some of the midrashim into the story. The midrash that didn't give you on the page, the midrash has at the end Abraham bursting out in protest. At the end, Abraham, in at least one version of the midrash, says, listen, I've been keeping this all inside, but God, you are torturing me, right? You told me that Isaac would be your heir. Then you told me I should sacrifice Isaac. Then you told me don't sacrifice. What do you want from me? And God's answer is not all that satisfactory. But Wiesel builds on this to draw a picture of Abraham who is absolutely attuned to the fact that God cannot allow the sacrifice to take place. Because God's already promised that Isaac will be Abraham's heir. God has promised, I don't know, I haven't counted, 10 times that Abraham will be the progenitor of a great nation. He's already kicked out Ishmael. There's no one left. So Abraham knows that God can't let this happen. Abraham gets the command and says, okay, it's a test. I get it. I could call God's bluff, but then I don't get anything out of it. Instead, I'm going to wait to see how far God will go with it. You sort of imagine those games of chicken where you drive at each other at high speed, and whoever turns first, has to bear the shame, right? Someone's going to turn, hopefully, right? But hopefully it won't be me, right? So I'll walk out with my honor and my life. So that's the game that Abraham's playing. He's playing a game of chicken with God. Let's see how far God will go. I'll walk up the mountain. I'll tie him to the altar. I'll bring a fire. Take out my knife. And finally God says, okay. Abraham, stop. Why? What's the point of this whole thing? Because now Abraham has God where he wants him. Abraham can now turn to God and say, God, you're playing with me, right? But now I won the game. You're the one who had to back down. And so Wiesel says it was a double-edged test. God subjected Abraham to it, yet at the same time, Abraham forced it on God. As though Abraham had said, I defy you, Lord. I shall submit to your will. But let us see whether you shall go to the end. God changed his mind and relented. Abraham won. When Abraham heard the celestial voice ordering him to spare his son Isaac, he declared, I swear, I shall not leave the altar, Lord, before I speak my mind. I contained my grief and held my tongue. In return, I want you to make me the following promise, that when in the future my children and my children's children throughout the generation will act against your law and against your will, you will also say nothing and forgive them. So I went along with you, God, when I knew it was impossible. I want you to go along with me when you know it's not deserved. Right? My children are not going to be perfect. I know that I can't pass on my faith to my kids. I don't know what the Jewish people are going to do, but I know that they're going to be rebellious. Right? I want them to be rebellious. But because they're rebellious, you're going to be tempted to punish them. And I want you to remember this one day when I was willing to go to the very precipice with you. Right? I was willing to do the most crazy thing because you told me to. You had to back down. And I want you to remember that when my children defy you, I want you to remember my faith, and I want you to hold that to their benefit. So be it, God agreed. Let them but retell this tale, and they will be forgiven. So in the Jewish reading, that's why it's the reading of Rosh Hashanah. One reason. Fire, there's the ram, there's all sorts of things. But there's also the merit. Right? The merit not of blind faith only, but also the merit of these dilemmas that we grapple with. Of Abraham's own dilemmas that he's grappling with, that he grows over the course of the story. Of God's dilemmas, that Abraham forces him into a corner and he has to back down. Rosh Hashanah is not a simple day. Right? Yom Kippur is a simple day. Yom Kippur has one theme. Dressed in white, deny ourselves our humanity, we repent and we pretend to be angels and we hope that that's going to solidify our year. Rosh Hashanah is incredibly complex. It's a new year, it's a festival day, it's a judgment day, terrifying day, coronation day, it's a holiday. What is this thing? Lots of things going on. The Akedah is a complex story. Akedah can actually hold a lot of that complexity. But one of the things is, as Wiesel says here, fine, we'll read this story, and God, we want you to remember the times that we did submit to your will. And this year, please God, may it be a better year. May God design a year that's to our liking, that will be much better than the past. Shalom.